Our first order of business is to call the roll to establish a quorum, and Mr. Nathan James will do that for us. Nathan?
Thank you. Michelle Simcox.
Here.
Representative White.
Here.
David Connor. David Connor. Senator Kelsey.
Michael Marin here for Senator Kelsey.
Ben Torres.
Here.
Ed Pruitt.
Here.
Chris Henson.
Here.
Sarah Morrison.
Here.
Okay. Frida Hammock. Commissioner Schwinn.
Mary Ann Dursky for Commissioner Schwinn.
Butch Ely. Commissioner Ely.
Greg Turner for Commissioner Ely.
Cliff Lippard.
Here.
Marlon Davis. Marlon Davis. Bob Eby.
Here, Marlon Davis shows up on the screen. He's muted.
Okay. All right. Well, we're counting him as here. And yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Sorry, I was muted.
No problem. Michael Smith.
Here.
Comptroller Mumpower. Robin Fairclough.
Here.
Dale Lynch.
Here.
Mayor McDonald.
Here.
So Peter Miller is, he's moved on to a different job, but we have not appointed his replacement. So for the Legislative Budget Office, who do we have? Catherine. Okay. Kurt Dronberger.
Here.
And Madam Chairman.
Here.
Do you have a quorum?
Thank you, Nathan. We have a quorum and we are duly convened. Now I'm going to call on Nathan to read the statement of necessity to conduct this meeting virtually. Nathan?
All right. And this letter goes to the Secretary of State's office pursuant to TCA 844-108B3, Tennessee Education Program Review Committee, the Basic Education Program Review Committee, by and through the State Board of Education hereby submits this letter as its determination of necessity for its committee meeting held via teleconference at 10 a.m. on the 23rd of August, 2021. Pursuant to 491302A4B, the BEP Review Committee shall, by the 1st of November each year, provide a report of the State Board of Education, the Governor, and the Finance, Ways and Means Committee of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and Committee of the Senate, and the Education Committee of the House of Representatives, on needed revisions, additions, and deletions, the BEP formula, and other statutorily required analyses. In the process, this committee also identifies its top priorities, and in order to review and finalize those committees, those priorities, this meeting was required. I just saw Jessica come in from the Office of Legislative Budget Office, by the way. Because of the time-sensitive nature of the issue and because members of the BEP Review Committee reside across the state, it was determined that a physical quorum of the members could not be assembled in Nashville for the purpose of this meeting. As such, the BEP Review Committee met via teleconference. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. I also want to note that without objection, the recording of the last meeting will serve as the minutes. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. Before we move into the discussion of the identified priorities, I do want to thank each of you for taking the time to complete the survey. I think it's important to note that our discussion in our last meeting has had an impact on our priorities, as you may have noted in the email that Nathan sent to you with a listing of the top priorities. So for the first time, we see that the ratio of nurses to students turns out to be the #1 priority based on the number of votes, followed by the counselors to student ratio. And then with technology, commitment to teacher pay, and increasing RTI squared receiving an equal number of votes. So it's important to move into a discussion and have confirmation of these priorities. And in particular, with the three that are tied for equal votes, we do want to rank those in order of priority just for the purpose of the letter. We want to have in a certain order. You may decide that it's based on alphabetically. There may be some other determination that you want to make. So without further delaying the conversation, let's go ahead and move into that discussion, because this will allow us to prepare the letter that will go to the governor, the Commissioner of Finance and Administration, and to the Commissioner of Education. So without delaying, let's move into discussion.
Madam Chair, if you'd like, I can go over the just a few things here.
Yes, please.
Sure. So what we did was we aggregated the total number of votes that each item got. So they improved the nurse to student ratio as the chair just stated. That got the most votes in either any priority 1 through 5. Counselors with number 2, technology, teacher pay, and RTI funding all with 7. We've been in that spot before, but one thing that we haven't seen before is something other than the continued commitment to teacher pay being the number 1 priority. And I think that it just speaks to the situation that the state has been in this, in this COVID situation. But those are the aggregated numbers of votes, and so I guess it's more or less a matter of the members deciding sort of what order you want to put the last 3 in, or offering any other perspectives.
This is Sarah. I have a question for our district folks on that point, Nathan, just given the significant amount of ESSER dollars that districts are receiving and trying to think about rank ordering for this particular budget cycle, technology, RTI, teacher pay. Would just be interested in your thoughts around prioritizing those given where you're able to use your ESSER dollars and where maybe you're not, as one way to think about how we rank order those 3 that are tied.
So this is Kurt Drumbarger in White County. And I'm just speaking for myself here. I want to speak for all the directors on the call, but I hear a lot of talk about the BEP in general, and that's, that formula is broken, it needs to be fixed and that sort of thing. I don't so much see that that's the issue. I think our definition of basic is the issue. I mean, we've talked about, legislators will say that this particular portion of the BEP is funded fully, and it is. But that definition of what is basic and how many people it takes to do a particular job is where I think we're falling short. And as times have changed, I would put nurses at the top of that list. As we're in a pandemic, I think everybody would agree that nurses are pretty important right now, and that 1 to 3,000 ratio keeps coming up. Here in White County, I have 1.25 nurses for 4,000 students. And so I think we'd all agree that that's not enough. So, from a legislative side, yes, they fully funded the BEP in that category. But from a director side of things, I can't run a school system with 1.25 nurses. And so I think that's where the problem is so much is the issue with what is basic. So to answer your question, Sarah, I'm using some ESSER dollars now to put back into some of those salaries, part of what we're using it for, to help alleviate our GP budget, because every one of our districts get paid this much for BEP, and we're running a budget that's up here because we're so many positions over the BEP. And I think I probably speak for every director in that regard. So to say all that, anything on that list that is going to improve student to staff ratios, whether it's counselors, nurses, or RTI, that makes top priority on my list because it's alleviating the pressure on the local to help do that. And then again, it just comes back to that issue of what is the definition of basic? Is that what we're trying to provide as a state, is the most basic education that we can do, or are we trying to provide a robust education and fund it adequately? So one more thing, and then I'll hush, but when we talk about teacher raises or teacher compensation, which is also on this list, part of the reason, you know, legislators hear that that money doesn't get into the pockets of teachers is because of that discrepancy that we're running at the local level. Because when that money comes in, districts are trying to lessen that gap that they're suffering locally. And so sometimes that 4% raise winds up being a 3% or 2 point whatever raise because they're trying to bring that gap in. So I think if, from my standpoint, this is me speaking from White County, anything that would help me lower that gap helps me address technology, helps me address teacher salaries, and gets us into a better position financially.
Chairman Hargrove, this is Dale Lynch. Can I follow up just a little bit to what Kurt said?
Yes, please do. Please do.
So we just recently had a new superintendent's academy last week and a TALS board meeting. So I spoke with Mary Ann a little earlier, and Mary Ann has always been, you know, our go-to person when it comes to the BEP. I thank everybody on this committee for recognizing what's very important as far as these top 5 priorities. But I would raise this to you all, if you all can see this on the screen. I really think that when we look at the Blue Book in regards to funding for our schools, you know, when we talk about nurses and when we talk about technology and RTI, I think before we ever vote on all those critical factors, we should know where we are as a state in funding these priorities. And I think that is probably a little short-sighted on me and others. But I will tell you, this is old data. I have actually asked for some new data, but don't have it yet. But when you look at nurses, there's a 304% variance in our state when it comes to nurses. And a positive variance means that our districts are funding that many more nurses over and above what the state is funding. And I think as a group, we should know what the variance level is at every single indicator on this BEP Blue Book. I think before we vote on anything, we should see what our districts are actually funding above what the state is actually funding for our local districts. And, you know, so I have, to the best of my ability, gone in with all of the components of the BEP and looked at what that variance level is. And kudos to this group, nurses is the highest variance by far. Then you have assistant principals at the next highest level. So I would encourage us as a group working together that we work with the Department of Ed to get those variances of every single one of those components.
Madam Chairman, this is Mayor McDonald.
Yes, Mayor McDonald.
The concern I have about what Dale presents is the different costs of living in these different areas, the cost of staff, the cost of all of these things in terms of putting together each district. It seems like going to be really hard to come up with something that will be agreeable to all the different types of districts we have, school districts. So I'm just concerned from that point of view. Maybe I'm just not understanding what I was asking for.
So Mayor McDonald, please let me clarify. I assure you, as a executive director of TALS, I don't want to hurt any school district when it comes to funding, whether it be a rural district or an urban district or whatever the makeup of that district would be. What I'm simply saying is I'll use nurses for an example. I think nurses, we came out in this group as the top priority, but I think it also shows when you look at the variance level of where the state is funding that, if school districts are already, like, let's say Kurt decided at White County, he wanted to have a nurse in every single school, but was only paid for one. They're funding that higher at the local level, but our recommendation still, because there's such a large variance, that funding, that state funding would go in there to help that 304% variance so those folks in White County can take that additional state dollars that the locals already contributing and put it in other areas of shortfall that they've had to wait on because their priority may have been nurses in White County. Does that help clarify?
Well, I think, yeah, I think I understand completely the meaning of what you're looking for. I just don't know. We've all lobbied the good folks like Representative White. And the thing I hear when lobbying is just give me the simple version. I don't know how we're going to give them a simple version with the kind of breakout you're talking about. That's where I'm having trouble, is how do we translate this in the halls of legislative areas, you know?
Chair Lady,
Yes, thank you for that. Who's asking to speak?
this
I'm
is Eddie
sorry.
Pruitt.
Please go ahead.
I think, Mayor, what he's trying to say is like maybe in the future, as we're getting prepared to vote on our priorities, we might have that as a data source that we might be able to use to help determine those priorities. And so we would still have our top 5 or whatever that might be, but we would just use, you know, where those ratios are the most skewed to help build for each person to kind of build their priorities. I would say as a director, all of those priorities, I'll echo what Kurt was saying, you know, this goes to the fact that, you know, when the state gives about a 4% raise, we typically can do about half of it because of what we have over and above the BEP. So as those ratios become closer to what we have, then we'll be able to increase that percentage to, you know, 2.5 or 3, or eventually get there to where we can do the 4%. And I think that's kind of what he was trying to get to. And Dale, if I'm wrong, correct me.
You're exactly right, Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you all for that answer.
Thank you
Is
both,
somebody
y'all.
else trying to speak? Yes, Mayor McDonald? Did you have something else to add?
Just thanking both of them for the explanation.
Chairman Hargrove,
Yes, Chairman White.
Mark White, excellent comments and very helpful to me. Appreciate everyone's input. But I would like to get back to Director Morrison's question. I know even though it's one-time money, I think the question was, how is ESSER money supporting or not through our districts on this issue?
Well,
Any
I will
Pruitt.
say in Johnson County, the ESSER money did help us get additional nurses assistants, you know, to help with contact tracing and you know, those issues. But again, it's finding staff to put in those positions. We still have 2 that are not filled. So, you know, that did help us with the assistance to help with contact tracing. But again, it's getting people in those positions.
Thank
Wayne
you.
County,
Mr. Pruitt, I'm sorry.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
In Wayne County, we are funded 1 nurse for our district, and we have funded 6, a supervisor over our nurses, and then 5 nurses in 5 different schools. And then we have 2 that we've added with ESSER funds in 2 of our high schools. And it's been hard to keep, you know, that funding level that we are able to pay nurses, it's been hard to keep those filled. But as far as to answer Commissioner White's question, was ESSER funds has funded 2 nurses, and the others we have funded ourselves over time.
One more question. Are the districts having trouble finding nurses? We're working on pipeline for training us nurses through CTE, you know, healthcare workers through LPNs to RNs. But I was told the other day, like Vanderbilt would hire 750 nurses a day if they were out there, and every hospital has a nursing shortage right now. Are the districts having trouble finding qualified healthcare workers or nurses?
We are in Gibson County.
We are in Johnson County.
We are in Wilson County.
We are in Wayne County.
Thank you.
This is Eddie Pruitt again, to answer Sarah's question and Representative White. We did use some of our ESSER funds for technology, and we used a pretty good chunk of that. And we also hired some additional RTI assistants and nurses. However, like I said, that money's only good for 2 years. And we know that we would hope that that will be able to continue that. So as we look in the future years, so I don't want that to totally shut one of those down, because it will impact us in the future.
This is Sarah, just jumping, and that it's helpful to hear the conversation, because I did wonder, particularly on something like technology, Eddie, you know, that's always been a priority for this committee and should continue to be, but maybe we need to think about including a note in the letter that makes clear that, you know, what districts have prioritized with ESSER funds is also reflected in part in this list, and then together think about, you know, sort of how we sort out the priorities of these different priorities. They're all important. I was just asking Nathan and Elizabeth, it might help to put the list up so that we can be reviewing that while we discuss in terms of where the votes fell out, but I'm a visual learner.
Sarah, this is Dale. I'm a slow learner and a visual learner too. So can I say something there, please? I think it would be real interesting. Not interesting. Let me take that back. That was a word I used with our board. I would just say, as a matter of information for this review committee, that technology dollars that the state is spending right now per student, and when I looked at this, is, you know, before we voted, I want to go back to see exactly what is the state paying for technology, and it's $40.96 per student. That is before that actually is 75% of the $40.96 because of the component of as far as where it falls in that BEP formula. So $40.96 at 75% of that. So I just think it's good for everybody to know exactly what we're spending. So I just want to share that with you.
So this, I'm going to jump in, and Dale, I'm going to make a statement similar to yours. I don't work with the BEP formula day in and day out like the districts do. But I've also heard comments with all the ESSER dollars. The ESSER dollars seem to be where you should be concentrating using those funds. And there are concerns that those funds would not necessarily be used in the way that they should be. Now, I've heard these comments. This is anecdotally, it's not definitive, but a lot of different comments about the districts are getting all this money. This should take care of their issues. They should not be asking for additional money. So I've heard those comments, and that causes me a little bit of heartburn, because in reality, I know these are temporary pots of money to assist you with the current crisis. And for the most part, your positions you're putting in place, regardless if it's nurses or counselors or RTI teachers, those are for a limited period of time. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a long-term need, regardless of the pandemic, for nurses. We've been talking about this for as long as I've been serving on the board, and counselors. So those are ongoing needs, regardless of the ESSER funds. And so I think somehow, some way, and I'm not sure if this is something that under Marianne Dursky and how complicated it would be to even, you know, request this and have you fulfill it. How can we literally understand and show, you know, Dale, you showed the percentage, you talked about the percentages, and 300% for nurses. That's huge. We know it's number one. There should be no question in my mind. This is my opinion, that is still the number one priority. It's an ongoing issue, regardless of the shortage of nurses, because the shortage of nurses has been out there for years. For years. It's not a new phenomena, and the colleges and universities have been working on this for years. And Chairman White mentioned CTE, and I know from my former day job, absolutely focusing on how do we move the needle in the right direction. But I'm going to stop, because I'm just wondering, how can we see a real analysis and allow others to understand that even though all these millions and millions of dollars are flowing into the state, it doesn't rectify the problem that exists day in and day out, regardless of a pandemic. So I'll stop, and Anyone want to jump in? Mary Ann Dursky, anybody that's a member, anyone in general?
Chair Lady
Go ahead,
Hargrove, this is Kurt again from White County.
Yes.
One example, you mentioned technology and the ongoing needs there, and every district, put a lot of money, especially I would imagine ESSER funds into technology, and then as we needed to, especially last year during COVID and doing virtual learning. So there were just, everybody bought thousands of Chromebooks or devices and put them in the hands of their students. So in 5 years from now, when those start dying, we're going to need to replace those. And so just to speaking to this BEP effort that we're in, I'm saving some money right now in salaries. I'm going to pay for some counselors. I'm going to pay for nurses out of ESSER funds and relieve my GP budget right now so that when I have to write that check in 5 years for more technology, I'm not going to feel so bad writing it out of my fund balance, because I don't imagine the federal government's going to show up with these ESSER dollars, 5 years from now. So that's what we're talking about, is the continuing increase that we need, a need we have for technology, things like that, is we're having to use these funds now, because you're right, they are one-time funds and we know they're not coming back. So we have to prepare for down the road for those gaps. And so that's where we're, trying to make up that difference that we continue to live in. And so that's one example with technology of, I would put technology needs farther down on the list if I'm looking at this list on the screen, because we've already met those needs right now with ESSER funds. But 5 years from now, I'm going to have to alleviate my pressure in the meantime in nursing and counselors in order to have some room saved up, some money saved up down the road to meet my technology needs and to address teacher salaries.
I think that's the crux to the issue, is that I think we need to realize that the ESSER funds are one time only, or 2 or 3 years or something like that. They weren't originally in there for recurring cost, but because of the situation, I think all the districts are using them as recurring costs, and I understand that. But I think that what we've done is we've pushed things down the road, but in 2 or 3 years from now, I think we're going to have a pretty significant issue on a lot of these things that are recurring costs that we used one-time funding for.
Other comments on this topic?
Madam Chairman.
Yes, Mayor McDonald, I believe.
Yes. I changed shirts. My wife got me cold in this room. So as I think about this, a couple of things come to mind. One, this is an example in municipal government where things like COP grants, where we have police officers use those COP funds for several years, suddenly no money, but still needed those COP. That's the same thing you guys are talking about in a way. You got, eventually you will pay for it. And that, I think, goes back to what Kurt was saying. And I am one that uses the phrase that the BEP is broken. And one of the parts that is broken is the part that Kurt brings up, and that is that the formula that was put together back in the day, it dealt with smaller numbers than we need today. And so we do need to look at what the needs are. And I understand we can do that based on money. We can do that based on number of teachers that it takes actually to get the job done. But we do have to address, in my opinion, this idea of the, when we talk about continued commitment to pay teachers, enough teachers to educate our children. It's got to be, if we just say to pay teachers within the BEP, well, I don't know that anybody's getting enough money that way. So we're going to have to say, I think we need to be saying that we would continue commitment to teacher pay in order to adequately fund the number of positions needed.
Well, and I'll just, this is Nathan. I'll just share that. I mean, obviously this is the very shortened version of it because, everybody phrased these things a little bit different. But yeah, the way we've said it in the past is, number one priority was continued commitment to educator compensation, overall. Basically trying to get that amount forward. The same thing with improving the nurse to student ratio. Some years we've named the exact number and some we haven't. And most of that gets entirely hashed out when we do the edit of the report for November 1. But this priority list here serves as a document buckets. Basically, these are the things that the committee is interested in, and that is sent, most especially to finance and administration for them to work with the governor's office in terms of building the initial executive budget. So, and that's how we found some success. So certainly we can phrase the continued commitment to teacher pay, or you could, if you wanted to, you could also say, fund more positions. But I think those things, obviously, as has been mentioned on this call, I mean, they aren't exactly the same.
Well, I just, because I also have the pleasure of serving on TASSER, and because TASSER is also looking at funding for education in terms of voices that help each other, I think it may make a difference. And I don't know if Cliff wants to speak to that or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Nathan, one of the things, well, let me ask the group because Kurt brought up the technology topic and technology being covered for his district. And with that being said, do we have confidence that that is true across the board in all districts? And I could jump to the conclusion and say, I believe that's to be true because everything that I hear and listen to. However, I don't want to jump to that conclusion without the other directors saying so. And then have a follow-up comment regarding that, because I'm wondering if we're in a position this year where we would not include it, even though it received the third highest votes with the other two high votes. And should we look to what else came up after increasing, well, those three, the RTI, the teacher pay, and the technology funding? So
the other half on that, Madam Chair, is kind of exactly what some of the other folks have talked about, is when, where we have seen some of the best movement in terms of this priority list gaining traction, right? It's when there has been a consistent message over time, and also where we're able to break it down into, reasonably sized chunks. It's one of the reasons that used to be when it was $700 million that was being requested at a time after the budget was put together, those things often never came to fruition. But maybe the solution would simply be, I heard earlier in the conversation, anything that improves the ratio as far as the people go, in which case you could do improve nurse to student ratio as number one, improve counselor to student ratio number two, do RTI as three, continued commitment to educator pay as four, and technology as five. In other words, because technology did come up so much, I think everybody's pretty keenly aware that even though they've got this bunch that came in now, that unless the is laid for a continued support, that'll go away later when districts need it the most. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's just been a lot of the conversations that I've had. So,
Nathan, I don't disagree with where you're putting technology on this. I would like to hear from the districts with regard to the commitment to teacher pay and RTI funding. And my question is you know, are you having difficulty in filling your teaching positions now? Are you losing those? How do you see the commitment to teacher pay versus RTI funding?
Chair Lady, Eddie Pruitt. I would like to see technology can stay in there, and kind of the way I view this list is they all kind of fall under the continued commitment to teacher pay, because by, like what Nathan said, by improving the ratios, you are improving teacher pay. So I think my suggestion would be to move RTI up and put continued commitment to teacher pay at the bottom, and almost say, have that caveat that all of the ones that we've listed above are ways that districts will be able to increase teacher pay, because the BEP will more accurately reflect what's actually being required in school districts. So districts will have more money to improve the actual salaries of teachers.
Thank you for that. Any other comments from other districts on this topic?
This is Michelle in Johnson County. I agree with what Eddie said. You know, I do think we are having a teacher shortage in Johnson County. Used to, we were having a hard time filling secondary, but we had all kinds of elementary teachers. It's sort of swung the other way now. So, you know, I definitely think we do need a commitment to teacher pay to try to recruit and retain effective teachers. I do think the RTL piece is important. I think the technology piece is important, just because of the reoccurring costs that will happen when all these devices start breaking down in a few years and ESSER is not there.
I agree. Marlon Davis in Wayne County, and it's kind of catch-22. You can increase teacher pay, but and bring in, you know, try to bring in more teachers. We're having trouble filling positions. I got 4 or 5 positions I haven't filled yet, and we're just trying to cover. So you got to start somewhere. I don't know if we, you know, we couldn't take a big jump in 1 year, but if you look at continuation of that as a focus over time, maybe we can get some of the young people that are getting out of our high schools to get into education. We used to not have a problem filling positions at all because we had homegrown people to fill those, and we'd struggle at times with secondary positions, finding the right certification and so on, but never with elementary positions. This year I couldn't find an elementary teacher, and still have 2 or 3 positions that we're trying to just cover in alternate ways, and still would like to get some more teachers in. So it's for it to get down to us, you know, the rural system, it's getting to a crisis, and kids aren't going into education anymore. Now, I have to admit, we're not doing a very good job recruiting and promoting teaching as a career, and we're going to have to do a better job of that here in our district.
Well, I think there's no question that's part of the solution is the homegrown approach and encouraging as opposed to discouraging. But I thank you for those comments. And are there any other districts that want to add to this discussion, this list, and the question that Bob Eby asked regarding your teachers? One of the things that I want to ask, and this may be, Nathan, in looking at the content of the letter that we send every year, I'm wondering if we need to modify some of that language so that it is clear when the letter is received by the governor. And of course, if we could ask Greg Turner with regard to the Commissioner of Finance and Administration, Mary Ann Dursky, would language be important to include that would help to clarify why some of these items are still on the list in light of ESSER? Because again, I don't know if that is necessary, but again, because I've heard things, and I don't know how much you all have heard, the understanding that some have, that these funds will take care of you for now, the ESSER funds. So with that being said, does anyone believe that we should modify the language to make it crystal clear these items are still on the list for a variety of reasons that were spelled out today? And Nathan, I don't know if you've been capturing all of that, but I'll stop to gauge any reaction.
Yeah, Chairman Hargrove, this is Greg Turner. I think certainly that would be helpful, because obviously the ESSER money is changing, you know, some of the funding in the districts, and so I think framing this request with ESSER in the background, I think would be very helpful for the commissioner and everyone involved.
Very good. Thank you for that input.
Chairman Hargrove, this is Dale Lynch again. May I ask the group a question?
Yes, please do.
Now, again, this is, for me personally, I have some strong feelings on this, but the entire group or part of the group may completely disagree, and that's perfectly understandable. And I'd like to know where they stand on this issue. You know, on these 5 topics, it seems to me like it would behoove us as the BEP review committee to talk more about specifics of each one of these goals. So for instance, on nurses, improved nurses student ratio got 11 votes. And right now through the BEP, we are funding them at 1 to 3,000. So would our goal to be take it to 1 to 2,000? And I asked the same thing for counselors. And I asked the same thing for technology. If we're $40.96 a student, are we trying to get it to 50? What is our goal? And the same thing goes to RTI funding, and absolutely the same thing goes to teacher pay. I mean, if we just talk about increased teacher pay, if we increase it by 1 cent, then we're successful on this goal, on what we're doing. But are we really successful? You know, where are we trying to get teacher pay? Are we trying to get it to be the best in the Southeast? Are we trying to get it? What is it that we're identifying is the target for each one of these priorities? And I find myself always going back to what is it that we're trying to get at? And I'm going to be quiet and listen to the group.
Lee Hartgrove, this is David Connor. I mean, I agree with Dale. I mean, I'm looking back at the statutory directive on the BEP review committee, and it says that we are supposed to annually review the components and make recommendations for needed revisions, additions, and deletions. So I think his point at the beginning about where are we finding parts of the formula that are the most out of alignment with how districts are spending their money, and in this as well as saying what's our target, what are we trying to reach, whether it's meeting the Southeastern average on salary, or whether it's meeting the recommended staffing levels for accreditation or things like that. I think really as a committee, we're not supposed to be saying, well, how does this work with federal fund, and are we seeing hiring shortages? It's really, what do the districts truly need? What do these components provide? And what do we think is the appropriate level of funding? And then, you know, if we look at some formula and determine that it's actually more appropriate to have 1 nurse for every 500 students or 1,000 students or whatever it is, I think we should keep our recommendations to this is what we think is necessary. And then all the money's fungible. So when it gets to the districts, they're going to decide whether to actually spend it on what we thought it needed. But I think our goal is to see where the formula is most out of whack with what we think the needs really are.
Excellent.
You know, one of
ahead.
the things that we did, like in 2019, for example, when we talked about counselors, the final wording that got agreed on was funding the number of school counselors at a level closer to national best practices, which is a ratio of 1 to 250. And the number 4 was lower the ratings to nurses currently funded in the formula at 1 nurse to 3,000 students. And Mary Ann can speak to this as well. I mean, go through and figure out what the cost would be to take it down to national best practices, and that usually goes in there. So in some years we've been more vague, and other years we've been more explicit. As far as the last couple of years in teacher compensation, it's just been sustained commitment to increasing teacher compensation was 19. 20 was continued commitment to increasing teacher compensation, with the number 1 of the whole LEA funding harmless. So, yeah, I mean, it can certainly get more specific as far as that goes. And I guess the question is, do you want to go through that wordsmithing in terms of the initial priority, where we're telling the departments where we're going on that, or would you rather do that?
Nathan, you trailed off at the end, or what you said, or would you rather?
Would you rather do that in the annual report?
I have an opinion, but I want to hear everybody else's opinion.
Well, if I would just throw in, and this is kind of going back to something that Mayor McDonald said, kind of was suggesting, and I think kind of riffing off of what David Connor was just saying, on the components themselves. This was one of the main recommendations that came out of our report this past year on education funding issues at the local level. Was a lot of our members, particularly our local government members, felt that there was a need to go back and look at the actual components of the BEPs and how each of those components is defined and whether or not they are sufficient. I know this is the kind of thing that I know the BEPRC's done in the past, though it's probably a component by component evaluation. You probably have to go back several years, but and I think it's along the lines of what Nathan was saying. You know, looking at best practices and actual costs. But that was one of the recommendations our commission made based on suggestions from primarily from our local members. And then one other thing. This is a bit of a callback to the discussion on nurses. Melissa Brown is also watching the call with us here, and she just wanted to remind everyone that's not as simple as counting the nurses, because you also have the contract option through the nurse program as well. So whenever you start slicing and dicing these components, looking at it, it gets quite complicated.
Thank you for that input, Cliff, and a reminder.
So,
Go ahead.
So,
Who's up
yeah,
next?
this is again. So I think that is a great point. And just for instance, on nurses alone, if we're already 304% out of kilter, and if we have districts that are contracting, think how much more we're out of kilter. But then also I would say is that looking how districts provide this information, such as RNs or LPNs or contracted services, like you're speaking to, there's a lot that we need to know as we make recommendations on this committee. And I'm not sure I quite understand the technology funding. Could I ask someone to explain a little bit of the technology funding for me? Because I think I think I'm not sure I totally understand the technology portion and whether there's an inflationary factor to that or not. Plus, we were in a hold harmless year with ADMs. Where are we with technology funding for that? Could I ask someone? I think I know who I would ask, but I'll let the chairman tell me who we need to ask for that answer.
Well, I'm going to put Mary Ann Dursky on the spot because I think she's the person that could tell us. I hope that's the case, Mary Ann, and we're not putting you on the spot too much.
No, that's perfectly fine, Chairwoman. Yeah, the technology funding is a little bit different than many of the other components. In the BEP, there is a flat $40 million designated for technology, and that is allocated to districts each year on the basis of ADM. We take the total $40 million divided by the total ADM in the state that's being funded via the BEP, and then take that per student amount times the number of ADM in each district. There is no inflationary factor. It has been 40,000 since I believe 2017. Prior to that, it was for many, many years, 20 million. This committee was successful in moving it to 40 million. As the number of students in the state typically has increased year to year, that per student amount then decreases because the 40 million is a flat amount of money. And so to Dale's point, there is no inflationary factor. And for hold harmless, districts received the per student amount either in the current FY22 BEP if they were not held harmless, or they reverted to the FY21 amount if they were to be held harmless.
Thank you, Mary Ann.
You're most welcome.
Madam Chair,
Crystal clear. Yes.
I had a question for Mary Ann on that to follow up, if you don't mind.
No, please go ahead, Ben.
Mary Ann, with the technology funding in the past, when it's been recommended, we've also noted the fact that some districts, and I'm looking at the previous report, wouldn't benefit from an increase in technology funding. My question goes back to the flat fee versus inflationary. If our recommendation wasn't necessarily just more money to technology, but to add an inflationary component like other portions of the BEP, would all districts benefit from that type of recommendation versus just a flat increase?
That's an excellent question, Ben. The answer is that no, not all districts would necessarily benefit from that. If districts are on minimum funding, and that is kind of equivalent to the old hold harmless and baseline, typically these are districts that are losing enrollment. Districts that are on minimum funding only receive the benefit of increases to the instructional category and the instructional benefits category, so that any improvements to components in the classroom or non-classroom section of the BEP would not necessarily be realized by those districts on minimum funding. And in a normal year, we have somewhere in the vicinity between perhaps 20 and 30 districts on minimum funding. So that is a consideration. And I will also point out that the nurse position in the BEP formula is in the classroom section of the BEP. It is not in that instructional section, even though it is a licensed position.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Do you have any clarifying questions, Ben? Because I think that was pretty straightforward.
I agree 100%. That answered the question.
Okay. Other questions or comments? So we've had a lot of discussion. Yes.
Yeah, Chairman Hargrove, Bob Eby. I've got one fundamental question, and maybe I'm just not remembering something. Going back to Nathan's comment on fungibility, and I firmly believe in local district control, but when we recommend, say, that we improve the nurse to student ratio from 3,000, and I like the idea if we can put a number to it. I like Dale's suggestion there to say 1 to 2,000, and say the legislature put that money in the funding to drop it to 1 to 2,000. And then it goes to the districts. They still, I mean, how do we at least encourage the districts to say, hey, this money is intended to bring down your ratio of your nurses to students? I mean, if it's fungible and they can spend any way they can, but what do we do? What does our committee do to at least show that, you know, we really think that that's an important aspect that the districts ought to be using that funding for?
Bob, I'm sorry. Can I get Bob? You're way smarter than I ever pretended to be, but I am going to give you a different way to look at that. Can I? Okay, and I totally get where you're coming from, but when I started looking at the variances, for instance, on nurses again, since you use nurses, wouldn't it be better for us as a review committee to look at how we're narrowing the variances, regardless of whether the districts chose to use that money on RTI positions? So if we're at because this is a 1.5, 2 years old data that I have, if we're at 304% on nurses, would we not be successful if we prioritize nurses and we got it down to 250, rather than seeing where districts put that money? Because obviously they did. Am I looking at that wrong?
So what we would get down to 250 is the funding that the legislature would send to the districts from 304 to 250. That the state would send to the districts from 304 to 250, and then the districts still decide how they want to spend it.
But the only way to get to 250, the 250% variance is what I'm talking about. That's just a made up percentage. The only way to get there is not based on what the state sends or funds in the BEP. It is based on how the district staff it.
Yeah. Piece. Question is how do you, when that funding goes, how do you get the districts then to focus to reduce that variance then?
Yeah.
Chair Lady? Eddie Pruitt,
Yes.
Gibson County.
Yes, Eddie.
To address what Robert was saying, and again, I'm speaking just for me. I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but the ratio is so high right now. We have the amount of nurses that we need, no matter what the ratio we get from the state. We just cover that locally. So it's, for me, it probably would not increase the amount of nurses we're going to hire. What it would allow us to do is take the money that we're getting and allocate those local dollars towards teacher salaries. That's what it would do for our district. And then that gets to the issue that Representative White hears, in legislature, where the money's not going, to teachers. Well, we would be able to use it because we're getting the more of the ratio of what we need to staff.
Do you think that's pretty representative across the state, that the actual ratio of nurses to students is far lower than the 1 to 3,000, far closer to the 1 to 750?
Yes, I mean, like Kurt said, I've got about 4,000 and I get 1.3 nurses and I hire 9. So I don't know of a district around that has the number of nurses that they get paid for. I mean, I guess maybe if it's a small district and you've got to have 1, I think that might be in there, but I'm not 100% sure. But I would say pretty much every district is going to have way more than what we're getting funded for.
Thanks. That's very helpful to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo what Eddie was saying there. We're about the same size. We have 4,000 students. I have 9 nurses, I have 8 schools. I have 8 nurses and a supervisor. And so that's where we're saying before that money would help us. We're already doing what you said, Mr. Eby. We're already, say, when the governor says we gave a 4% raise to teachers, we're already having to go to our teachers and say, okay, well, wait a minute, here's what that really means. And we're having to spin that story and tell them here in White County, it's going to mean a 3.2% raise because we're covering our nurses. So it would help us, and I go back to what Lillian said, we need to clarify that list. If I'm going to put, as a BEP review committee member, if I'm going to put continued commitment to teacher pay at the bottom of that list, I want to make sure I'm clarifying what these top 3 are going to do to allow us to make up that difference. But I agree with everything Eddie was saying, and we have the nurses we're just already paying for them.
Kurt, there's one thing to think about there. I mean, just exactly as you all have talked about, the nursing, the counselors, RTI. I mean, every bit of that is about being able to concentrate more efforts on compensating teachers, right? I mean, that's it, or at least that's a trickle down effect of it. And so, I mean, one thing we've done before is we've had a group 1 and a group 2. There may be some way to attach those together. The other thing to think about is I know we say if we aim to close it, that would be fine. I would just suggest that we do continue to at least reference the national best practices number when we're making this point. The Education Recovery Innovation Commission, they're certainly wanting to weigh in and about the same thing in the course of their annual report come out at the end of the year, dealing with educational innovations. And the issue of the nursing ratio and counselor ratio, this has come up several times there. So, just going ahead and asking for the national best practice number, even if only half of it came through.
Nathan, I hear what you're saying, and I'm sitting here thinking, I'd like the opinion of Greg Turner, if he would jump in on this. When you think about it, if we were to go with, several people have recommended, let's have a specific goal, and whether it's a goal for nurses of improving the ratio from 1 to 3,000 to 1 to 2,000, then there's number crunching that I know will happen with FNA to determine if that's even feasible. Whatever we put in there, how will it be received by FNA, the governor, the commissioner of education? So I say that because I want to understand, we have to come back to the list. We have to determine what we will say as opposed to what we have written here on the screen, more specifically for each of these when it comes to the goal setting. But just to gauge Greg, when you think about it, if you were to see from us an improvement of the ratio of nurses to students from 1 to 3,000 to 1 to 2,000, what would be the steps that you all would take at FNA as an example?
Well, obviously we defer to Mary Ann to get us the numbers. Like you said, what would that number look like? What would that be? What kind of cost increase that would be? And then working down the list here. Obviously, we would look at the money available and those types of things. So, but I think any type of specificity is better in this type of process. If the review group feels like getting to a certain ratio is important, then I think having that in there helps both the Commissioner of Education and the Commissioner of FNA to understand what's important to this group and how much that would cost.
With
So
that being said, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
I know, you go ahead.
With that being said, once the numbers are provided to you by Mary Ann, and you look at, so we've asked you to ask for a lowering of that ratio for students to nurses, for counselors to students, RTI teachers to students, et cetera. And you see that number, the final number with the teacher pay request, the technology, however we word that. What would you do if, when you add it all up together and it's not affordable, that the state decides within the budgetary year that it's not possible to do all of that? Then what would you do when it comes to modifying the number of the ratio, those ratios, if you will? Do you know?
Well, I think obviously that would be something that working with Commissioner of Education and then obviously working with the legislature as well, we would have to go in and then try to say, where can we get to within the budget that we have? And so I think that's the difficult part, right? Is that once you get to a certain point and you have to start making decisions based on not only education, but on higher education and, DCS and those types of things. That's where you get into trying to judge what can we do and what is important to the BEP committee, what is important to the legislature, and those types of things. So I think it's difficult to say where we would land, but I think that's the thought process is once we get to a certain number, what can we fund and how does that kind of relate to other things that the governor's office is wanting to carry out as well, other initiatives that the governor's office is interested in.
So then just taking it just one more step, as an example, utilizing nurses, if the data, the numbers come back and reflect that instead of lowering it from 3,000 to 2,000, that perhaps it could be lowered to 2,500, would you all in fact come up with a change in that ratio based on the calculations Mary Ann has provided to you to come up with a reasonable number? To give more money, to put more money in the formula?
Well, again, I think probably what we do is we take a look at the end of the day, what sort of the priorities overall of the governor's office would be, how it relates to the priorities given to us by the BEP review committee, and then how that relates to the priorities coming from that we know maybe could be coming from the legislature as well. So again, for me, it would be difficult for me because I would not be in that room making those types of final decisions. But I think the process would just be, what can we do with the amount of money we have, and how does that relate to the priorities that the BEP review committee has laid out there, priorities we've heard from prior sessions, bills that have been brought forward in prior sessions from the legislature. And then, of course, priorities coming from the Department of Education as well.
Greg, this is exactly this back and forth that we're having right now is one of the reasons that, for the last several years, we have structured the priorities the way they are. I would remind the members that, for instance, if you pull up the BEP report from 2020, looking at page 9, for example, our fourth priority was funding the number of school counselors at a level closer to national best practices. That phrase was the priority. In the report, we put, as the role and scope of responsibilities for school counselors has expanded in recent years, members of the BEP Review Committee have reported strong stakeholder interest in decreasing the current ratio of students to school counselors. School counselors utilize professional competencies to create comprehensive school counseling programs. It goes on that the BEP formula currently provides for school counselors an average of 1 to 500 for grades K-6, 1 for 7 through 12. However, recent guidelines from the American School Counselor Association identify a ratio of 1 to 250 as the national best practice. The BEP Review Committee therefore recommends additional funds be allocated within the BEP formula to bring Tennessee's ratio into closer alignment practices. If the General Assembly chose to lower 1 to 250, this change would increase state expenditures by $64,521,000. So in each priority identified in the years past, we also fill it out with a lot more detail in the report. For instance, we had this discussion about increased funding for technology and accessibility. And in our wording there, we said the BEP Review Committee recognizes the increasing importance of technology and instruction. Notwithstanding federal dollars, the Review Committee wishes to reiterate its recommendation from past years for renewed increases in technology funding, especially considering the need for expanded access and maintenance of equipment for remote and virtual instruction. So it's not a matter of do we have the one short phrase and nothing else gets explained. The rest of it is something that we have been capturing and putting into the report, which is required in statute, along with appendices. This is something her team, in terms of getting all the numbers crunched, they just do yeoman's work on every single year. So I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page as far as what that looks like.
Nathan, thank you certainly for reading that and reminding everybody what is included in the report. And I'm sitting here thinking, the F&A, they're doing their thing. Mary Ann's providing them the information that they need. I've been through budgeting processes. It's nothing like that at the state level. I know it's more complicated at the state level. Who's actually looking at the report when they're in the middle of doing their number crunching and looking at what this committee has requested? Because we know the governor has his priorities. We're providing guidance on what we think the priorities are based on this committee's recommendation, but who's going to sit down and sink their teeth into the report, which is important to have, so don't misunderstand me. It is important to have that. It is a document produced by this committee with our team working diligently, as you said. But in reality, are they going to look more at the letter or are they going to look at the letter? I'm just being honest with you all, in my opinion. I want to make sure that the letter captures as best it can the details of what this committee is requesting it to capture. And if it has to say reference the report, whatever, for the granular details, that's certainly fine too. And I don't have the letter in front of me, Nathan, so it may already say that. So I'll apologize.
No, it doesn't. I mean, because in the past we've decided that if we wanted it to say all that, I mean, for instance, the funding of school nurses is 2 paragraphs, and when we have figured out the exact numbers, it's not always necessarily available in August, but it does become available later on. And Mary Ann, correct me if I'm wrong on that. We certainly could expand the letter to be basically, if you're looking at your BEP report, it would be it'd be the entire 6th section of the report. So you're looking at 1, 2, 3 pages and several appendices in order to hit the exact number. Whereas when we have left it open in the past, for instance, on computer technology, we didn't ask for a specific amount, and so they doubled it. It went from 20 to 40. But no, I totally agree with you. I mean, ultimately, the reason we do this letter is because so many times the report on the 1st of November might be a day late, $1 short kind of thing.
Exactly, because I think whatever we can include in the letter, it behooves us to do so that if they at least have the letter at their disposal. And in belief that they will be digging into this and taking into consideration the desires, the requests, the priorities of the BEP review committee, that they will have what they need at their disposal. And it doesn't hurt to reference the report, but highly unlikely that they'll have time to dig into that. I'm a realist at heart. So I think whatever we can put into that report, that's my opinion. And anybody else want to jump in? Because we do need to come back and make sure that we get this list written out the way that we want it, with the priorities written, with the ratios we think we should include there, or however you all want to finally word it. Any other comments?
Madam Chairman, this is Ben.
Yes, Ben.
Listening to all the conversation and kind of going back to the original intent of this call is to list out our priorities and how we want to list them. I would say the first two items need to reflect the vote, the nursing and the counselors. And I would say in the letter, closer to best practices. I kind of feel like putting a number in there may shortchange you if they have the ability to put more, but it's making them aware that the ultimate goal is 1 to 750 for nurses, and for counselors it's 1 to, I think it's 350 for 7 through 12. That's the ultimate goal, is to get it there for those two. The next I would say would be RTI, and then under that the continued commitment to teacher pay. But in that continued commitment to teacher pay, I think the caveat should be added in there that if you're improving the three above that, the nursing, the counselor, and the RTI, you're going to improve that teacher pay, because as some of the directors have highlighted, they're going to be able to free up those funds. So I don't want the perception to be that, well, teacher pay is number 4 on the list, so therefore it's not as important as the others. I think highlighting in the letter that all these work together, and that by funding one, you improve the other. I think including that in the letter may be important. And then technology, I would list as number 5, just because when you're looking at immediate needs versus long-term needs, I think those 4 are the immediate need, and then in the long term, improving that technology. And kind of going back to the inflation item that Mary Ann listed, maybe mentioning that it's a flat fee, and even just adding an inflationary component would be helpful. And then some other components of the letter. One thing that struck me, we're doing this letter and we're doing the report, but it's really for implementation in the 22-23 school year. So we're going to be even closer. If they fund everything in this report, we're going to be even closer to those ESSER dollars going away. So I think it's imperative to say that, and to highlight that fact. And then finally, everything we've talked about, when you look at nurses, counselors, when you look at teacher pay, when you look at RTI, and even technology, you're talking about people or things that directly interact with the student on a daily basis. And I think I would like to just highlight that what we're talking about in these items are things that directly impact students. And I know it goes without saying with this group, because a lot of them are in the district and dealing with students and teachers on a daily basis, but every one of these items directly interacts with the student on a regular basis. And I thought it would be helpful to emphasize that that's the ultimate goal. That's why we're all here. That's why the directors are here too, is to help the students and for the students. So that would be my take on the letter, and kind of getting back to the original intent of this call. So certainly open to comments, or if somebody has a different suggestion, but I thought I would maybe start that conversation out with that.
Before anybody else jumps in, Nathan or Elizabeth, can someone update this list? At this moment, it's just to capture what Ben said, because I believe it was Kurt that also had a similar list and the order. And I'm thinking at this point, it's not the votes, it's what this group is deciding relative to how this would look in the report. And even Ben, personally, I like what you said regarding the framing of this in the letter. But I'm wondering if we could look at this to what Ben just suggested, and then once it's back up on the screen showing the reflection of the order in which Ben has suggested it, I know at least one other person did too. Then gauge your reaction, because Ben, you talked about the ratios on all of these nurses and counselors being in line closer to best practices. And we should go ahead and write that language here too. The technology you mentioned, the inflationary component, perhaps we add that so we can then gauge reaction. We can start gauging it now, but let me just ask, Nathan, can we do that?
So my computer would not join this meeting, so I'm literally on an iPhone. So
can Elizabeth, is Elizabeth?
Are you on, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Can you change the order and make that update?
I'm sharing a PDF, so if I'm making changes, it'll take a few minutes.
Maybe even in the chat, Elizabeth, you can just like you did initially.
And while you do that, then we're not going to wait. I don't want to waste any more time. Not that we're wasting time, but delay this. Hear from others.
Well, and while she's doing that, one thing that I think would be good to put in there, not just say closer to best practices, but say, you know, where we are from 1 to 3,000 to best practices of 1 to 750 or 250 or whatever it is, because I think that shows the stark reality of how far away we are from those best practices, which I think is an important point to make.
So I think you said you could include the language that says closer to best practices and include that ratio of 1 to 750 if that's the correct number.
From where we are right now today, right, of 1 to 3,000.
Exactly. So, I think we can add that gauge reaction. Yes, is that you, Nathan?
Yeah, it is. Are you all also wanting an accurate calculation of the precise cost to the state for each of these that we're asking? Because the way we've phrased it before, in order to give the legislature and FNA some wiggle room, was like, yeah, like I said, if the General Assembly chose to lower the ratio to 1 to 250, it would increase state expenditures by $521,000, and that's in 2020 dollars. So are we wanting to do the expenditure costs as they are now, and then Marianne, are those numbers? Is that something that can be calculated in terms of this letter?
To calculate the cost of the recommendations?
Yeah.
Yes, we would use current year values as we usually do, and go ahead and calculate the cost of any of the proposed changes. Yes, we can do that.
So you could, what we could do is pull the language then from the 2020 P report, which let's see, BP currently provides funding for school counselors at an average of 1 to 500. But you want, in addition to that, you want to know the exact number per district, not the average, or what is it, Bob? That
no, just the average. The best practices is 1 to 250, and
right.
And the current average is 1 to 500. So I mean, it gives
same stuff as we had.
Kind of bounds the issue and bounds the problems, and helps, I think, with the priority is showing why we're putting nurses or counselors so high, is because I think we're so far away from the best practices on those areas, and those are two critical areas that are important to student success.
Okay.
And I have no problem putting the dollars in there. I mean, somebody's going to calculate the dollars, so why shouldn't we calculate the dollars? I think it's just, that way we know it's right.
We're talking about adding the funding, the cost to move to the national averages on those two components, the first two.
Yes, I mean, somebody's going to do that calculation, so,
Marianne is going to do it.
So that's pretty easy. I guess the question is, when we say RTI, what are we asking for RTI?
I would say would one of the directors jump in there and tell us?
This is Kurt Drumbarger. Is there a national best practice on that? I mean, is
Well,
there?
no. So what we came to for last year was that the BEP formula currently funds RTI squared positions at a ratio of 1 to 2,750 with a minimum of 1 position per school. And then we just said if the Tennessee General Assembly chose to lower the ratio of 1 to 1,000, per school system. I'm sorry, not school, per school system. My mistake. Yes, chose to lower the ratio to 1 to 1,000. This change would increase state expenditures by 24,965,000. If everybody is good with using the same kind of target that we did last year, then we know we're aiming to change it from 1 to 2,750 to 1 to 1,000 at a rough cost of 25 million.
It's fine by me, Eddie Pruitt, Gibson County. Typically, they, when you're looking at RTI, you're looking at about 10 to 15% of your population that's going to be served. I mean, that 1 to 1,000 still, it's better than the 1 to 2,750, but, you're looking at about 10% of your population that you will have to serve in that area. So
I don't know how this plays into it either, but that one position, as Nathan was alluding to, is a district-wide position, and it's funded at a starting teacher salary. So in order for us, like in my case, I'm using a retired teacher in order to be able to afford somebody that has enough know-how to manage RTI. So that's one of those things where the legislature says that it's fully funded according to BEP. They're correct. But there's one position funded at the lowest salary per district, and as Eddie was saying, it takes dozens of people across your district to make that happen because you're talking 10 to 15% of your population. So I don't know if that's a conversation necessary for this particular board, but the amount of funding for that one position is at the basic level.
For future years, could we get best practice or have somebody do some research to find out what best practices is for RTI? So that we've got that comparison if we can't get it this year.
I'm sure we could. I don't know that other states quite call it the same thing. Is that I looked somebody with more of a practitioner's background that's done this from state to state. This is called different things in different places, right? So I'm just having in the back of my mind that there's been some difficulty figuring out exactly what the comparisons are. But this is just my brain going. Is that right, Sarah? Is that something you can shed light on?
Yeah, RTI is certainly used in other places, but just specific implementation guidance. We can look into it more from the interventionist standpoint, I think, in terms of tiers and levels and get more information, Bob, certainly. But it may be a little apples to oranges. We'll just do our best to pull together sort of what that looks like in a more natural.
Thanks. Anything I think would help us and as guiding us in future years would be good. Thanks.
I'm right now kind of typing out and pulling from last year's report the exact language that we used there, so that I can email that to Elizabeth and then have her put it up so we can see kind of the exact language we've used.
I do want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that Elizabeth, actually, did you do it, Kurt? Looks like you did. In the chat box, the order of the priorities have been listed based on what Ben shared with us, I believe. Trying to make sure. Exactly, yes. Now, the language would be modified in keeping with perhaps what Ben has shared with us, but we are coming to a point in our discussion where we may be ready for a vote, or we want to talk about would everyone be accepting or approving of this order, or anyone objection? Let me say this, let me back up. Does anyone object to the order of putting the nurses to student ratio first, as your vote indicated, the counselor to student ratio second, RTI third, continued commitment to teacher pay fourth, and the technology funding as the last item with the inflationary terminology. And in the language for the other items would be in keeping with trying to come up closer to the national best practices, reflecting where we are and where we want to be. Is that correct?
Madam Chairman, I'll move that. This is Mayor McDonald.
We have a motion from Mayor McDonald. Is there a second?
Second,
Who provided the second? I'm sorry.
Mark White.
Hello?
Did we lose Lillian?
I just heard someone. Are you all
This
able to hear me?
This is
You hear me?
Bobby. I can hear you, Nathan.
Okay, something happened there. Technology glitch. So we have
Did you?
a motion and a second.
Okay.
We have an opportunity for further discussion. And I didn't hear anyone, but I could have missed it. Any further discussion? Nathan, would you call the roll?
Sure. Michelle Simcox,
Yes.
Representative White,
Yes.
David Connor,
Yes.
Michael Marin,
Yes.
Ben Torres,
Yes.
Eddie Pruitt,
Yes.
Chris Henson,
Yes.
Sarah Morrison,
Yes.
Rita Hammock, Commissioner Schwinn,
Pass.
Commissioner Ely,
Greg Turner for Commissioner Ely, pass.
Cliff Lippard,
Pass.
Marlon Davis,
Yes.
Bob Eby,
Yes. Yes.
Michael Smith,
Yes.
Comptroller Mumpower, Robin Fairclough,
Yes.
Dale Lynch,
Yes.
Mayor McDonald,
Yes.
Legislative Budget Office,
Jessica Himes, pass.
Kurt Dronbarger,
Yes.
Seventeen ayes and 3 passes. That's the order is agreed to. Or it would be, yes. You certainly passed.
I voted aye too. I'm not sure if
Yes,
that,
ma'am, Madam Chair.
you did. Okay, you skipped me. My
I
vote doesn't count.
apologize.
No, that's okay.
I'm
So
sorry.
that's okay. So the ayes have it, and the motion to approve the priority list based on what we discussed already today, and it's in the lower right-hand corner of your chat box. So we are now beyond that point. Thank you all so much. A very robust and important discussion to get to the point where we are. The next item on the agenda is I believe it is authorization of the priority letter. And Nathan, do you have any questions or anything else you want to add with regard to the development of the letter after today's discussion?
No, ma'am. And that's gone different ways in the past. It was, it's been your letter on behalf of the committee for the most part. I think what the instructions of the committee are fairly clear, that we want a paragraph of explanation along with the fiscal implications of each of the recommendations we're making. And so I think what will be appropriate is a motion to authorize this letter to be crafted at your direction, which, like I said, you could do anyway, but it gives a good opportunity for folks to weigh in and authorize it. So.
And Nathan, I do want to note that Greg Turner did indicate that it would be beneficial to have some framing of the priority list in mentioning of the ESSER funding. It may be something we would want to circle back with him, especially after we have a chance to look at the letter. We typically, in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know you send the letter to everyone, but is it before we actually send it to the governor and the commissioners that everyone has a chance to look at it?
Well, in the past, it's been basically it's up to your discretion there. It's something the committee, votes on the priorities, and you have I write the letter. You have me change it however you want me to change it. We can't do a survey to make sure everybody's okay with it. That constitutes a meeting, basically. So it's just needs to be up to your judgment. If we could certainly work with F&A on it, but it's really a letter under your name and on state board letterhead on behalf of the BEP review committee.
Correct. And the fact that it's on behalf of the BE Review Committee, I do want to make sure that it reflects the discussion today. And unless someone has any objection to it, I do want to have us circle back with Greg Turner to discuss the framing of the ESSER funding, just in light of the fact that previous discussions today and in the past, that there should potentially be the need to add that so that there's no misunderstanding on the part of anybody in the governor's office or the commissioners in what we are understanding, what our own understanding is, and we want them to have the benefit of our understanding and what the reality is on the ground. So is there any objection to adding some framing about the ESSER funding as we previously and earlier talked about today? Any concerns there? Hearing none, I think we should go ahead and move forward in that direction. Nathan is correct. I think the timing of the letter and getting it out quickly is important, but also making sure that the content is accurate, reflecting your desires. So I'm just going to ask you to trust that between Nathan and our team and myself that we will have that letter reflecting the conversation and the vote today. Is there any objection? So without objection, that's the way we will proceed. Nathan, is there anything that you want to add in regard to our next meeting? We typically have added on the agenda a next steps conversation, but is there anything in particular, since it's not on the agenda, that you want to add in the way of a closing remark regarding next meeting?
I would say usually, the third meeting of the year is going to be where we edit and approve the final BEP report. That sort of thing usually happens in the tail end of October, largely because there are certain documents and tables and things that simply are not available until October, that all have to be included in the annual report. So I would say, expect the meeting in the last week of October. That's been pretty standard, and we'll end up going line by line and making corrections and then agreeing to it. And then the fourth meeting of the year is usually in December sometime. So I think that's fairly likely. Now, as far as the October date goes, you can't set it too early because, and Marianne will back me up on this, the reports and the documents are not always necessarily available on the same date. So that's why I say, please be flexible with your last week of October.
Thank you.
Nathan,
Yes. Go ahead, Mary.
This is Mary Ann. I just wanted to ask the timeline for the letter, if we're going to include the estimated state cost for some of these recommendations. When do you need that information from the department?
I mean, we've typically gotten this out in August, so it'd be something that I'd write in the next week. And what I'm sitting here doing, kind of as we're going, is pulling the language that we've used from the report itself in the past, and then I'd send that to you so you could plug in the updated numbers. And so, but I think if you, and I would say this to members as well, if you want to feel for exactly what that language will look like, please, look at the previous BEP reports, because they're the ones who go into the increased explanation. That's all section 6 of the BEP report annually. That's where your explanations and calculations are from these policy priorities.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. Moving into closing remarks, is any other comments or discussion points from any of the members before we adjourn? Thank you all so much, very much. I know this has been a lengthy conversation today, and a very important one to get to this point where we can have the letter prepared and sent to the governor and the commissioners. Without objection, this meeting of the BEP Review Committee is adjourned. Thank you all.